Okay, we've got a few familiar faces and some new names as well. I'm sure a few more will trickle in, but may as well make a start, everybody. So first of all, welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. My name is Kitty and I'm the Nature Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network. I'm so glad so many of you have been able to join us for tonight's webinar. In light of everything that's happening, I'm sure the news will be equally as riveting a watch, but I'm glad you've made the time to be with us. Tonight's webinar is on the topic of boosting your local recycling rates. And I'm really grateful for OPRL, which stands for the On-Pack Recycling Label, for sponsoring tonight's event. And we'll hear from them shortly as well on the panel. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a little bit of context for tonight's webinar, and then I'll pass over to our panelists. So, as we know, people across the UK interact with the waste system every single day in some shape or form. And so it's no wonder then that for voters, they often judge the success of their local council by using factors relating to waste, such as bin collections, recycling rates, and the presence of litter and fly tipping in their local environment. It's also no surprise, therefore, that Defra has made waste crime and boosting recycling rates a key facet of the Environment Act when it was published last year. Within the Act, it contains lots of measures for local councillors to enact to improve the local recycling scheme, such as the introduction of a deposit return scheme for single-use drinks containers, standardising recycling rules across England, and introducing labelling requirements. But the success of these measures depends on the people implementing them, and that means local activists and local councillors across the country. And so the purpose of tonight's discussion is to explore what that means for councillors and how we can all work together to improve recycling and reduce litter across the country, and how to engage your voters along the way. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our first panellist tonight, which is Marissa Heath. Marissa is a Surrey County Councillor, and she's the Cabinet Member for the Environment, as well as being a member of SEN's Councillor Network. Over to you, Marissa.
Thanks, Kitty, and good evening, everyone. As Kitty said, I'm from Surrey County Council, where I'm the Cabinet Member for Environment. In Surrey, we spend 92 million approximately collecting, managing and processing recycling and waste. And actually, we've got one of the most improved recycling rates. If you go back 10 years ago, we were 46.4%, which was the 13th highest nationally. But actually last year, we became the third highest nationally at 55.1%. So we've been doing some things right. But what we do know is there's still over around 20,000 tonnes of plastic, paper and card, glass and metal that could be collected for recycling in our county. And we also know that I think it's almost 14,000 tonnes of recycling gets rejected when it comes to post-collection, where it comes to the sorting, because it's been contaminated. So we've got to find a way of addressing this if we want to boost our performance towards our rate, our target rate, which is 65%. That's what we're aiming to get to from the 55.1% we're on at the moment. And it's also therefore about improving the quality of the materials and the prices we receive. So it works for us both in an environmental sense and an economic sense. Obviously, I think it's still Recycle Week. I'm presuming that's why we're talking about recycling. Yeah. And the contamination of recycling bins is a really topical issue. We have a group called the Surrey Environment Partnership because we're a two-level tier here. So we've got district and boroughs and then the county council sitting over us. And we've created the Surrey Environment Partnership so that we can work together and try and tackle some of the problems, because what tends to happen is we kind of work in different ways. So each borough has a different sort of way of collecting things, and sometimes even different things they collect. So we're trying to sort of come together to tackle the problem. One of the biggest issues we face is actually food waste, contaminating our dry recyclables and our residual waste as well. So we collect 50,000 tonnes of food and we get almost the same amount, 40,000 to 50,000, contaminating our residual waste. That's a big problem for us. And I think what it's really shown us in Surrey is we already have a lot of separate food collection. So the small caddies that are collected on a weekly basis, that's quite normal in Surrey, but it's not being used properly. So to me, that really shows that it's not as simple as just offering recycling solutions. You've got to work out how people are going to use those solutions. Culturally, it seems quite a lot of the UK thinks it knows a lot about recycling, but actually there's not much precision around that. So we still find a massive issue in our recycling is batteries being thrown away, which is a big problem because they cause fires. and even stuff like nappies being thrown in recycling, and in fact electrical products as well. So I think it's all very well kind of setting what you want people to do, but it's not often, well, it's not often, sorry, that's probably too general, it's not always getting through to people. I remember I lived in Tokyo in 2001, and the flat I rented out had a dustbin drawer, and it had about 5 or 6 separate components at that time, 20 years ago, separating all the various items. And the citizens took it really seriously over there, how they did that. So I think we've got a long way to go in the UK to get to that point, but certainly a lot of work to just get people understanding what they need to do in recycling. We give leaflets out, we put things on bins, we have apps, all of those sorts of tools. So we are working a lot on that. One of the things we've done, and if I can just bring it down to a borough level for a moment, because I'm a dual-hatted councillor, at Runnymede, we had a real problem with the contamination. We were one of the worst performing authorities. So we actually made a choice to really target this. And the way we did that is we did some very specific training of staff, and we took a no collection approach with a sticker. So if any bins were contaminated, a sticker would go on it and it would say, this won't be collected, and this is the reason why. And we'd have communication with that household to tell them why. And as soon as they had decontaminated the bin, we would go and collect it. So we were being reasonable. We weren't just saying we won't collect it full stop, but we did start to be a bit stricter about this, and we'd upped our education. So we used our refuge team to talk to residents, to push out newsletters, to put those stickers on. And just doing that, we moved up the recycling performance label table. We were about 188 out of 345 authorities. And by the end of doing that over a year period, we were at 85 out of 345 authorities. So it just showed what training and working with your teams can really do. I don't know how long I've got, Kitty, but I would just make the point that one of the biggest problems we've got is obviously flats and apartments, and how you target those and get the responsibility for what goes in bins with those. And again, this is an area we've been really working on by sitting down with management companies and residents and looking at how we can improve the offer to flats and apartment blocks. And again, where we've done really targeted work, it has made a difference. It's resource heavy, and it's very difficult to go around all apartments and blocks doing that, but it does actually work if you do that educational element with people. We've also got a really strong strand on not just recycling, but we're looking at reuse and those whole sort of things around upcycling, how we get shops set up, how we get communities involved in that upcycling. And that's proved really positive. We're currently doing our strategy, our 5-year waste strategy, through that Surrey Environment Partnership, where we've actually said, let's really focus on reuse. People need to listen to recycling, it's very important, but there's other sort of areas that we need to focus on as well to just drive down waste fully and get people using products in a different way. Finally, I'll just end by quickly saying that consistency is crucial to increase recycling. And you mentioned it at the beginning, Kitty, about standardising recycling. We've got a different approach across the country. We've got different approaches regionally, and we've even got different approaches locally, as I said, across Surrey. So we have to find a way of standardising that and working with partners. We use 3 different MRF contractors. They've got different approaches. They take different things in. And so we as an authority are really thinking about our ability to process materials in-house. That will give us control. So we'll be able to look at our waste and drill down to where the problems really are. It will give us visibility, and we can get that granular detail on what's going on and address it. I would just say education is absolutely crucial. And I know it's easy to talk about education. We do it in so many ways, but actually our residents, I think, have a will to do this better. And it's how we use our resources effectively to do that and share best practice. So that's our little story across Surrey, which I hope is useful to the conversation.
Thank you, Marissa, and lots of really interesting points, and I hope we'll cover them at the end in the Q&A portion. And on that note, if you do have any questions as our panelists are talking, please do drop them in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will pick them up once all the panelists have had their turn. And on that note, the next speaker is Mike Gardner. Mike is the local authority technical consultant at WRAP, where he works with the local authorities across the UK, and that work is involved helping officers assess their service design options, implement major service changes, and develop communication plans to go along with them. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thanks very much, Kitty. Good evening, everybody. Kitty said that I work as part of the local authority support team, and I've been working with local authorities over the last, nearly 2 decades now, which just a little bit scary, and that's included the Surrey Environmental Partnership. as a result of that engagement, we've got, I suppose, a good working knowledge of the types and the varieties of recycling schemes across the country, but also a good understanding of the data and what people are collecting and what their performance is. So if you were to ask me what's a high performing authority, if you're to look at recycling rates, then you're probably looking at those authorities that are achieving 60%, maybe even a little bit above 60%. But I think you've got to be careful when you look at recycling rates, because they not just it's perhaps a bit of a crude indicator. For example, a big chunk of that performance might well be from garden waste, and garden waste may be relevant in, for example, Surrey, but might be less relevant in an inner city. So clearly the inner city authority, you're not really comparing like with like. So you've got to drill down a little bit beneath the headline figure to understand what's going on. However, if you exclude the garden waste issue, I think there's kind of two key factors that are driving recycling performance, and Marissa touched on one of those, which is the range of materials that, collected for recycling. And if you look at those high performing authorities, they're all collecting a wide range of materials, including things like batteries at the curbside. But a common factor or a common feature amongst all of those high performers is that they collect food waste at the curbside. And given that about half of England's local authorities currently don't collect food waste, then that's going to be a big win. And given that it's also part of the Environment Act, that requirement to separately collect, I think we can see a big step change probably in the performance of authorities over the next few years. But there's another factor, I think, which is also interesting, and that's and common amongst those high performing authorities, and that's a squeeze on the residual waste stream. In other words, the non-recyclable waste that goes in the general waste bins. Those high performing authorities either limit the size of the residual bins, in other words, give people smaller bins, or they reduce the frequency of the collections. And obviously over the years, we've seen a move to fortnightly collections, but there's a number of authorities now that we're seeing that are reducing that frequency down to 3, or in a Welsh and Scottish example, even once every 4 weeks. So that's really nudging residents to use the recycling rather than the residual bin. So I think from RAP's perspective, we would view best practice as a kind of combination of those two key factors, offering that wide range of materials that can be recycled at the curbside, supported, as Marissa said, by good communications. That's absolutely vital. The householders need to know what can be recycled and how to recycle. So that's an absolute fundamental. Really such that recycling becomes the social norm. It's just something you do. It's something your neighbours do. It's something everybody does. But I also think there's a key role for restricting residual, so that you reduce the amount of residual waste that you have to dispose of. And I guess also from a local authority perspective, that latter point, the restriction of residual, provides an opportunity to make savings, because residual waste is expensive to dispose of. The less you have to dispose of, the less you spend on that. So I think from RAP's perspective, those are the kind of two key elements, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mike. And next up, we have Trewin Restorick. Trewin is the founder and former CEO of Hubbub UK, an award-winning creative environmental campaigning organisation, and he's also just recently launched his latest venture, Sizzle. And he is also, for the benefit of this conversation, voted in 2022 by peers as the most influential person in the UK's recycling and resource sector. So over to you, Trewin.
Hardly the Oscars, but I'll take it. So thanks, Kitty, for the introduction. So I've been asked to talk about behaviour change campaigns and how you can actually get people to use the facilities that are hopefully there. And I've got 3 minutes. So 5 things, I think. I also want to cover littering as well as recycling, and recycling on the go as well as recycling in the home, because they're all part of this complicated picture. So in terms of littering, which is a real bugbear, as I'm sure you're all aware to the public, we ran a campaign. It was funded by McDonald's, where we flew drones over the whole of Bournemouth seafront. And we used AI so we could track exactly what every single bit of litter was, the company that produced it, and when it was dropped. And then we used that data to work with the council, first of all, to talk to other companies about reducing the amount of litter that was produced in the first place. Secondly, to think about the location of bins. Thirdly, to think about when bins were collected. And fourthly, to do targeted communications. That one campaign managed to drop littering by 75% at a seaside location. So I think the first thing is using sort of drones and AI technology to capture data, working with a big corporate to fund it for you has proved highly effective. The second point is linked to that, which is the importance of collaboration, particularly with the business sector. And this is going to get more and more important as the new waste legislation comes in. There are a lot of industries out there, like, the plastics companies and others, who also know that littering and recycling is very high up on their agenda. And what we found is that they're really keen to put authentic schemes in place, which means collaborating with local authorities. So we've run many campaigns, for example, in Kensington and Chelsea with Innocent, Leeds with about 20 companies, where actually the companies not only funded, put in the resources, but actually assisted with the communications. So collaboration with corporates is really helpful, and also with community groups, because you've got to be able to target specific areas with specific messages. The comms itself, we've heard a little bit about how important it is. Targeted messaging is so important. In Kensington and Chelsea with Innocent, we targeted the 8 things that people were most confused about in the recycling, and just kept banging on about, this is what you do with those particular items. We found on the go that colourful, playful, positive messaging works. So in Bournemouth, we did a test where we used negative messaging around littering and positive messaging around littering, and the positive messaging far outperformed the negative messaging, and it has to be ongoing. Authenticity is crucial, particularly around recycling. We've got a very sceptical public fired up by sort of seeing films of plastics ending up in sort of various countries about what actually happens to the recycling. And we found where we could tell a story, a circular story, and demonstrate that and show what products things were being turned into and where it was being turned into stuff. It gave people a lot more confidence in the authenticity of the story. And there's been research in Wales shows that authenticity really boosts recycling rates. And then the fifth thing we looked at was incentives. So for littering in the street, we created a ballot bin so people could vote for their favourite footballer with their cigarette butts, and that massively dropped recycling. We've tested reward schemes, and again, people do respond really positively. But we've also found that there can be disincentives. So a lot of councils use those big bins with the really heavy lifters on them for some of their street collections. And we found that a lot of children and elderly people couldn't use them. So, thinking about the sort of bins, and people don't like to get their hands inside a bin because it's all dirty. So just really simple things like bin design just makes a massive difference.
Amazing, thank you so much. And we'll come back to, I'm sure, a few of your project examples, because I know how effective they've been in my own projects that I've engaged with, and it'd be great to share more details of those. And our final panelist is Margaret Bates. Margaret is the Executive Director of On-Pack Recycling Label, OPRL, tonight's sponsor, which is a voluntary labelling organisation with hundreds of members across the country using the labelling system, and 3 in 4 consumers able to recognise it. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Kitty. I always say to my friends, or I did when I first started the job, you won't have heard of OPRL, but you'll know exactly what we do. So we're the people, we're the not-for-profit that decides whether someone gets a recycle or do not recycle label. So that label that you see on the high street or in your homes, that's what OPRL do. And we're recognised as experts in this by UNEP and Consumers International. And pretty much every big brand you can mention will be a member of ours. And also, and I think this is really telling, a lot of small businesses as well, because it's really important to them that they have the shelf recognition So whereas it might seem obvious that Procter & Gamble or Co-op or whomever, Tesco, need to put the recycle, do not recycle label on it, also, if you're trying to establish your brand, you want it as well. And Kitty mentioned that the government's introducing some groundbreaking changes to how we manage our waste and recycling. So we talked about the consistency of collection from business in householders, making businesses pay for the cost of dealing with the packaging they put on the market, and deposits on drinks containers. And these really do represent an amazing opportunity to bring about a fundamental change in the recycling of the UK. But they will require, as every local authority knows, the cooperation of citizens. Councils can't collect and recycle materials that citizens don't put in the right place at the right time. And OPRL have worked with local authorities for many years. In fact, the Local Authority Recycling Advisory Committee is one of our guarantors. And we're unique in that we reflect the whole supply chain. So we understand the interests of local authorities, manufacturers, retailers, and citizens. Our labels are based on evidence, and that's why people trust us. So we're considered by many to be the arbiter of what's recyclable or not recyclable in the UK. So that trust has taken a long time to build up, and it will be very quickly lost if we don't bring in mandatory labelling correctly. So recycling rates have plateaued and even dipped in some cases in recent years. And it will take positive consumer engagement through effective labelling to remove this trend. It's not only, as Marissa mentioned, the increase in recycling that's important, but the quality of the recyclate. So contamination, putting the wrong thing in the wrong bin, is estimated to cost local authorities in excess of £51 million a year. And a recent survey by Barratt Homes suggested that understanding which items can and can't be recycled could be a major reason for householders struggling to become more recycling friendly. And our own research has shown that 3 in 5 people don't recycle something because they don't understand whether or not it can be recycled. So it's really obvious that we have this clear need for clear and consistent messaging that citizens can understand and involves minimum effort from them. So government's released plans for mandatory recycling or do not recycle labelling on packaging from 2026-27. And that will be based on the OPRL labels, and it needs to build on our expertise. So as part of this plan, the Office for Product Safety and Standards, or Trading Standards, as most of us would know easily, has been appointed as the regulator to ensure compliance. But we have concerns that they don't have the resources or the expertise to enforce those standards correctly. And if they don't enforce labelling correctly, it risks that producers will put the wrong label on, either deliberately or accidentally, and this will reduce consumer confidence, contaminate recycling. And if the consumers lose faith in recycling, then it could cause a drop in recycling rates, and also from a local authority point of view, mean that you'll risk being considered not effective and efficient, which are the key factors in the new legislation for determining how local authorities get money for recycling to from producers for recycling to subsidise their costs. So it's vital that we ensure continuity. We're all aware of the negative impacts of rumours and misinformation on recycling rates and service engagement. And it's really important that organisations that are currently using a robust and audited scheme are able to continue using that, both before the new regulations come into force, but also afterwards. So there's not a change from what citizens see. So Defra estimates that EPR will cost businesses 1.7 billion annually. This has gone down from 2.7 billion. But if we don't have continuity in design and operation, there'll be an additional cost, a cost that will be passed on to consumers. Do not think that the producers can swallow these costs themselves. They will be going straight on. So although labelling might be seen as a very small part of much bigger legislation, But as the phrase goes, for the want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. It's only a small part, but it's a vital part. We need it to engage citizens. And if we risk getting labelling wrong, we risk getting the whole system wrong.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you for putting it into the context of the wider policy discussions that are going on in government at the moment. Turning to a few questions and points that I've seen in the chat, one of them is around the influence of demographics of an area in recycling schemes. And I suppose this ties in with assuming areas such as London have big demographic diversity. They're also probably likely to be using the bins that Truan's mentioned that are harder to use for certain segments of society. So is there any tips from the panelists on how to deal with if you were a councillor in a demographically diverse area, how you can deal with that to avoid inadvertent contamination of recycling and perhaps even boost it with correct bin choices? Would anyone like to come in?
I think this, if I could come in, Kitty, that we know that deprivation, there's a direct correlation between deprivation and levels of recycling performance. That's just a fact. And obviously in urban areas where you have a high churn of householders, maybe the students, or it's just more transient populations, that's even more of a challenge. So there's no getting away from that. It's much more difficult. I think I've seen some pretty interesting work done by London, which is the organisation in London which helps the London authorities recycle, looking at how recycling can be made easier for householders in flats and transient population. And I guess, as Truan alluded to, it's down to good communications, being an imaginative communications, and continuing with those communications. There's no quick and easy fix. You just have to, as Truan said, you just have to keep on banging on about it.
Margaret, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of initiatives that will really help on this. So the consistent, this answers some of the other questions in the chat as well. So the consistency that we referred to basically means that, and this is England, because there are similar systems already. Wales has a blueprint, Scotland has, what Scotland's called, something similar, framework, whatever it is, I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is basically saying that wherever you are in England, you will have the same things collected. So it won't matter if you move, if you have a different term time address or a different home address, the same things will be collected. And this also includes, Mike mentioned about food waste being collected as well. So what this will mean is, because the same stuff is collected everywhere, local authorities will be able to have very clear, consistent messaging. And there's also money in the regulations being spelled out for hopefully national campaigns that will make this much easier. So this is also important for having consistency in communications. So one of the reasons we think you need to have the same label is when you've translated all your stuff into different languages and you've communicated it to people, you don't want to then go, oh, by the way, that's now changed, don't use that label, use this. So there's a number of things that will all tie together. So the same things will be collected, it will have the same label on it. You should be able to trust what the label says, so you can be confident when talking to your citizens about what that messaging should be. And that should give some great ideas and great incentives to be able to do some more imaginative and bigger impact behaviour change stuff, which I'm now handing over to Truan.
Oh, you're muted, Truan.
Should know by now, really. Yeah, I'm going to start with something a little bit controversial, which is I've seen so many bad recycling campaigns, and it's, recycling officers are brilliant at what they do, which is quite a lot of engineering stuff, structural stuff, system stuff. They're not always the world's greatest communicators, and they're not always the greatest understanders of what changes behaviour. So thinking about who's compiling your messaging and making sure it's the right people with the right skills, I think is important. The second thing I think is so many campaigns are devised from a group of people sitting in an office deciding what they think is going to work best. The best campaigns work when you actually go to your block of flats or your hard to recycle areas and actually see what's happening in practice. And I've done this, and I've seen brilliantly funded campaigns falling over because the bags that they gave to the residents were too big for a lot of the residents to actually lift. And there were blocks they blocked up the hallways. And, you know, it's a really small detail which actually turned what could have been a very successful campaign into something very difficult because it wasn't thought through from the user's perspective enough. And finally, to think about who are your authentic voices. You know, if you're working with certain communities, you know, it could be that religious leaders are really important, or there are strong community leaders, or, you know, there's a certain sort of group of people who are highly respected. And if you can get them on board, particularly in those hard to reach areas, and get them to tell your message, it's much, much stronger than a local authority necessarily spreading the message. So finding the sort of community champions and using them as your voice and your advocates can have a massive difference.
We love a bit of controversy on the Send webinars, Trin, so don't worry about that. And Marissa's got her hand up, so I'll pass over to you, Marissa.
Yeah, just I mean, I'd agree with everything that's been said, but also a different approach is looking at it more widely as well. So how do we work with communities, as I mentioned when I spoke about toy libraries, about, you know, for example, we've got a paint shop at our CRC, our community recycling centre, where you bring your paint and we give it free, but we've made it into an actual shop so people don't feel like they're just being given something for nothing. It feels a nice way of getting your paint. How do we get all of this stuff sort of moving so people in lower and more vulnerable households are already using recycled stuff, but it doesn't feel used, and, you know, it still feels good to them to get it. So it's all that work and reuse, and also about getting our community workers out to teach people to reduce food waste. So how can they cook, how can they store food, how can they use the things that are going off in their fridge and stuff constructively. So basically you just drive down waste, full stop. So I agree with everything that's been said, but it is broadly about just having less waste and working with those communities to show them how to do that in a really positive way.
Absolutely, thank you. Those are some excellent answers, panelists. Having a look at the Q&A and the chat, it seems that collaboration is on the minds of our participants. True, and I know you alluded to this in your opening remarks about some exciting collaborations you've worked with, but how can councils across the country get involved in these collaborations? Is it a case of waiting for someone to come to them, or what can they do to kind of put themselves out there and get these collaborations? Mike, I don't know if you wanted to come in as well after this.
Almost did it again. I think collaboration is so important, and the difficulty is that it's very rare actually that the private, public and sort of the community sectors come together to unite behind a campaign. It can always be sort of groups of people talking down their own channels, and it can sometimes, particularly be between community groups and corporates, be a little divisive. So what perhaps I can just give 3 examples very quickly about how that sort of collaboration happened. So the first one was with Innocent Drinks and K&C. So Innocent Drinks are headquartered in K&C. So they wanted to prove that they were a good neighbour in their area. They obviously are very concerned about their image and the containers that they produce and how they're perceived by the public. So, and they're brilliant at communications. I mean, smoothies talk to you and people buy them. Weird, but it's true. And so what we did was we basically said, you know, you want to do these things, K&C's in your area, you're very concerned about your resource use, your brilliant comms team. And so we brought their comms team and their budget and their reach in touch with the council to jointly create a campaign, which they then pushed out. So they had messaging on the side of their refuse vehicles. Their messaging went out to households. They plastered the area with posters and billboards. So that's an example of where one company had something in an area. With Leeds City Council, we basically went to 20 of the largest sort of retailers and packaging companies and said, you've got a massive problem about recycling on the high street. We want you all to contribute a certain amount of money each. So it was a fixed amount of money. So I think we asked them for about 20,000 each, 20 companies. So that budget was then made available to Leeds City Council, and we said to Leeds, can we play in your city? Can we prove that recycling on the go can work? And basically the companies paid for the infrastructure, they paid for the messaging, they paid for the bins, and they helped sort of build the market for collection. So that was where a whole group of companies had a problem. And then McDonald's basically know that most of the anti-littering campaigns, the traditional anti-littering campaigns, haven't worked. So they wanted to test whether new technologies could work, which is where we used a breakthrough company that we found who use drones and AI. And honestly, the impact of that campaign was absolutely incredible. That just using that high quality data, so we could go to McDonald's and say, this is your litter, you know, this is your stuff, these are your napkins, this is where they're going. We could tell the council exactly when they should be placing their bins because they were all in the wrong place. We found out when litter was being dropped and what type. So, you know, we found a lot of littering on the beach was at night. So we invented disco bins that lit up so people could actually see them. We knew that there were areas where there were family beaches where people were leaving like plastic toys and stuff on the beach. So we could change the messaging there. So that detailed granular data that we were able to get through that sort of really helped. So those are just some examples of where you bring a corporate into the mix, you get more resource, more creativity, more reach, and you know, a new way of thinking.
Changing tack a little bit, but maybe give some examples of collaboration between local authorities. And I mentioned earlier food waste and the fact that pretty much half of the authorities in England don't currently collect food waste. There's the potential for a kind of stampede over the next while as authorities compete with one another for available processing capacity, compete with one another for trucks, for all the kit that they're going to have to purchase to deliver those services. So I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration between authorities to help make food waste and deliver food waste in, I guess, as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. And we're certainly seeing, because food waste is often more effectively delivered as almost a kind of standalone service with separate trucks, for example, it lends itself to the concept of shared services or services being delivered by a consortium of authorities. So I think there's, with that service and the fact that there's economy and greater economies to be gained by working together, I think we're going to see more collaboration between local authorities and across the two tiers of authority that Marissa talked about earlier.
Marissa, did you want to come in this?
Yeah, just to say I totally agree, collaboration is key. But I mean, there's, you know, we're at a stage in Surrey where we're looking at how we manage all of our waste, our contracts up for renewal and all of that kind of thing. Now, obviously, we're limited in terms of space, as is every authority, but could we partner with authorities? I mean, we're surrounded by Sussex, Hampshire, Windsor and Maidenhead, all of these other areas. Is there collaboration where you can come in and say, where can we find the space and put in the joint funding to deal with certain ways of dealing with these products and things? So for example, Tetra Pack, I think I'm right, and one of the people who's much more expert than I on the call can tell us if I'm wrong. I think Tetra Pack gets around the extended producer responsibility, but there's only one place that can deal with it, and I think it's in Lincolnshire or something. So we're not recycling Tetra Pack in Surrey, for example. So those sort of things, could we collaborate with neighbours and things and find ways of dealing with that? I don't know.
Margaret, would you like to come on in this?
So two things. Firstly, other makes of cartons are available, not just Tetra Pack.
Of course.
And they are collected. In fact, the trade organisation behind them have put a lot of effort into having a number of different collections. And although we all think, oh, it'd be great to have it recycled near where we are, they're recycled in Halifax. It's quite well established, and they're also looking at some of the other difficult to recycle schemes as well. But don't forget, a large amount of our recycling gets recycled abroad. So actually managing to recycle it in the UK is a pretty good achievement. And hopefully one of the things that EPR will bring forward is it will help us invest in the infrastructure here. So when we're talking about a circular economy, we can actually have things that are collected, recycled and remanufactured, reproduced back in the UK. Adding to the thing about collaboration, because I think collaboration and partnership are the key answers to pretty much every environmental problem. There's also some really interesting stuff being done in the thing that takes the pressure off local authorities. So, for example, Boots have been pioneering collecting small things. So small cosmetic packaging that will never be collected at local authorities because it'll never make it through the sorting system. It will go through it. So there's opportunities to have combined communications around that. And we've seen in the last few years a significant rise in the amount of supermarkets that are collecting plastic bags and films as well. So it's not just about partnership between local authorities and others. It's about how other people can have partnership to increase recycling rates outside the pressure just on local authorities.
Can I quickly come in on the Tetra Pack one?
Of course.
Vested interest. I'm an advisor to Tetra Pack. And yes, they are recycled in the UK, and also, Tetra Pack is basically mainly paper based rather than sort of fossil fuel plastic based. So there are advantages to Tetra Pack in other ways. But Tetra Pack are just about to announce that they will provide funding directly to local authorities to boost the recycling of Tetra Pack, because actually their plant in Halifax is not operating anywhere near full capacity because local authorities are not collecting the Tetra Pack. So they've decided to invest in local authorities. So Marissa, if you're interested,
in my direction, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I'll hook you up with them.
Great.
Fantastic. Somebody has just mentioned in the chat as well about other sort of privatized collection schemes such as TerraCycle. I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on slightly less mainstream options for recycling.
I think you've got to be super careful with some of these. I think some of them are quite opaque in terms of what they actually collect, where they actually go, and what happens to the materials collected. And I think we have seen quite a lot of greenwashing where certain companies have linked up with some of these specialist recyclers and said, oh, you can recycle Walker's crisps by doing this. And I think the evidence about actually what happens to them is pretty hard to find. So I think you've got to be careful on that level. And also you've got to think about the overall resources. So, if you're collecting very light, hard to recycle products, and then they're being transported to a certain place and then probably stored for quite a long time before they turn into who knows what, is that really the best way to manage resources? It's much better to build in the consistency that we've heard about to sort of like make sure it's part of the overall infrastructure, rather than having lots of little sort of schemes set up perhaps on the whim of a corporate who needs to cover their back on something. So I think you need to be quite careful about some of these initiatives. And if you do go down that route, sort of really question the environmental and actually the circularity validity of it.
Yeah, just to add to what Trim was saying, if you're talking about a company like TerraCycle, what they're trying to do is they're trying to recycle the niche stuff that's never going to be mainstream. It's the sort of singing to the choir. Whereas I think what we have is what we need. We're talking people who are on this call almost by definition are going to be engaged, and we've got. I think the challenge is to try and get those people who aren't engaged to make it easier. So a TerraCycle system might help you with your niche materials, but people who can't be bothered to put stuff in the right recycling bin from their local authority, which is collected from their doorstep, are unlikely to collect it, post it, and do all the other stuff. So I think there's a lot of focus on the mainstream. You know, we're not even close to 100% recycling on any of the major recycling streams, which pretty much every local authority collects. So I think if we're going to make the difference to the recycling, and I totally agree with what Mike said about food waste, we need to focus on that and getting the people who aren't engaged, rather than getting the people who are doing probably 95% recycling to do 96.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Margaret. Another issue that's emerged in the chat that we've already touched upon slightly, but it would be great if we could elaborate further, is on about recycling on the go. I know that Hubbub has got a whole website devoted to its In the Loop program for recycling on the go strategically, but I wonder if there's any tips to do this correctly outside of the beach context, but any advice that panelists can give to attendees on that issue specifically. Well, you've done it again, Sherwin.
Good job, I didn't swear. So Hubbub has got, there's a campaign called In the Loop where recycling on the go has been tested in 7 different municipal areas and has been individually measured. So there's a lot of data about what does and doesn't work. And there's really simple things like people don't spend any time standing by a bin. You've got to make them colourful. You've got to be really clear about what goes in it to reduce contamination, which is an even bigger problem on high streets than it is through homes. You've got to put the bins in the right place, blah, blah, blah. But I think the problem for local authorities is the ever moving goalposts of when Defra legislation comes in, because if you know that there's a commitment to have deposit return schemes, so I think that commitment sticks, but when they actually arrive is a bigger question. So you know that could transform recycling on the go on high streets. It could transform littering because those items will have a value. So I think local authorities, particularly with budgets so tight at the moment, they're in a difficult position, which is you don't want to start investing in system A when in 2 years' time system B arrives on the doorstep and you have to completely change it. So I think just keeping an eye on where the government legislation is heading, because these are profound changes, as Margaret mentioned, that are in the pipeline. So just being aware of that and planning for that scenario. I'm sure Rap know way more about this than me, but that's what I would say.
I wouldn't suggest for a moment that we know way more than you, Truan. But I would certainly agree that because of the changes and some of the uncertainties and the inherent difficulty, I guess, of collecting recycling on the go, and we talked about contamination earlier. You're going to get contamination and recycling on the go. It's probably one is that if I was a local authority, I'd be thinking, well, there are other easier wins and probably more important wins. And one issue we haven't talked about really is carbon. Recycling performance, I think there's lots of different ways you can measure it, but I think the carbon impact is something that we really need to be aware of. I mentioned earlier garden waste. The benefits of recycling garden waste from a carbon perspective are relatively minor when you compare them to the benefits of, say, recycling textiles. So I think there's more to it, and it's about thinking where the real wins are, and I would suggest that carbon is one of the factors you need to take into account.
Definitely, that's a really interesting point, and I guess drawing on that, how would you suggest that councils prioritise these different streams of waste? For example, a few people in the chat have drawn attention to EWaste, for example, which I know is, I think, the fastest growing stream of waste in the world at the moment. So that could potentially become a very big issue if it isn't already. So how do we prioritise these different streams of waste beyond what we know as recycling at the moment?
I think, as I said, I think there's a danger if we just chase recycling targets and just think that, if we all go for 60, 70%, and think that that's a be-all and end-all, whereas it isn't. There are other things we need to take into account, like carbon. Rare earth metals is another issue that is clearly something you have to take account of, and it can appear really confusing, but there are tools available. There's carbon accounting tools. RAP is one, the carbon warm metric, which can help authorities understand how to calculate the carbon impact and just understand better what the carbon impact of recycling different materials actually is. So there are tools out there to help you navigate what can be quite a confusing environment.
Absolutely. Margaret, would you like to go next, followed by Truan?
Yeah, I was just going to be a bit more pragmatic than that, Mike, because realistically, local authorities have got so many things pulling on their funding at the moment, not just waste. Basically, by the end of this year, we're expecting to have some guidance that will, at least a response from government that will tell us what legally needs to be collected as part of consistency. If you're a local authority who's going to want government funding to be able to increase your service or to maintain your service, you're going to need to provide an efficient and effective service, which is going to involve collecting those. If you don't collect the things that consistency tells you you must, you're unlikely, I would suggest, to get as much funding as someone does. So although textiles might be great or whatever else might be, you're going to be focusing on your packaging and your food waste because that's going to be the obligation. And the messaging, one of the advantages, and this will be why I'm glad Troy's following on from me, one of the advantages of recycling is no matter what you really say, the message is put that thing in that bin. If we then start talking about carbon, that becomes a much more complicated thing to talk to consumers about. And if we then start talking about some of the other behaviours around refill and reuse or waste reduction, then the messaging behind that is so much more complicated. I mean, we've produced a refill label as well, and it's quite interesting to map who's downloading that refill label. But one of the reasons I think a lot of people focus on recycling is just because it's relatively easy. And don't get me started on electronic waste. I spent 20 years doing electronic waste.
Truan, would you like to go next? And sorry for triggering you there, Margaret, on e-waste.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about e-waste. So I think, let's be realistic about the situation the country is in, which is we're facing a massive cost of living crisis, which is going to impact on so many people in all our constituencies. And actually, I think there's space to think about resource use more generally. About e-waste is a great example about the value of that equipment that is thrown away or not being used even. So we have a scheme with O2 called community calling, where we get people to hand in their their smartphones, which are sitting in drawers in businesses. We physically clean them, digitally clean them, and then give them out to people who are digitally isolated. So basically, you're sort of creating a closed loop sort of economy, and people are doing it not because it's recycling; it's because their smartphone can help somebody in their community who can't connect with their doctors or friends and family. And similarly, toy libraries, community fridges. There are many ways that we can think about, getting the fullest value from the resources that we throw away to the benefit of society. And I think the recycling debate can get quite technocratic. And actually, it's an emotional thing for many people. They don't want to see stuff wasted. They know that the stuff they have has more of a life and could be used to benefit to their community. So I think the more all of us can do to create sort of a closed loop system which provides benefit to those who might be struggling at the moment, the better.
Definitely, I think moving up the waste hierarchy, as it were, is vital, but the cost of living crisis is giving it a renewed sense of purpose. I wondered if, Marissa, you wanted to come in and give some case studies on that issue, as I know you have been doing a lot locally on reuse.
Yeah, we have, and it is proving quite successful. I mean, it's resource intensive, but we have found community groups who've stepped up and taken those roles on. And I think if you empower those community groups, they will do it. But I say that my approach to it is not to look at it in isolation. So, for example, I look at my NEETs cohort, which is not in education, employment and training, and look at how we can skill them in terms of upcycling and things like that. So we're looking at setting up a large facility, basically, where we can take I say young people, but actually people of any age who might be suffering from certain mental health problems, or they're out of work or that kind of thing, and training them and working with them around upcycling, and then knowing it's a shop where residents can come and buy things. They will pay for them, but they'll be a lot cheaper than they'd be in the shop, and these will be nice things. So we'd do that with household furniture, with toys, with electrical items and things like that, and we solve more than one problem by doing that. Same with the food waste. I'm looking at my land management framework, which I'm currently planning out. We control thousands of acres of land and farmland, and I'm wondering what I can do with my food waste on those farms, for example. So I'm trying not to be narrow in my thinking. I'm trying to look around the whole council and look at waste as a resource more and more, as often as I can. So I think we can tackle more than one problem with that. And obviously cost of living, as I mentioned with my paint shop, you know, a tin of paint is what, between 10 and 30 pounds. I don't buy much paint, but it's expensive. And when people are doing things like community projects and things like that, we should have the paint ready for them. We shouldn't be throwing things like that away at all. We should be using it. So setting those things up and just putting that bit of time in to make it feel like a positive project. You're not getting waste, you're getting something important and valuable here. Create shops basically and things like that. Don't make it look like we're just sort of trying to get rid of waste. So that's how we're approaching it. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marissa. I've just had a look at the time and we're very close to the end of this webinar. So I thought instead of closing remarks, perhaps we could go around each panelist and give a few top tips to councillors to go away with. Mike, would you like to start? You've done a true and you're on mute.
Dear, oh dear. That should have given me a little bit of time to think a little bit about something. I actually think the climate element is important, because that's one of the reasons why we are recycling. So I think my word of advice, if you like, would be the performance indicators are, there is more to it than just the headlines, and to think very carefully. There's a danger that we fall into a trap of chasing targets just for target's sake. We have to understand what lies behind those targets, and what ultimately the objective is.
Marissa?
Collaborate, look for partnerships even outside of your area. And the second thing would be with education is consistent and repeat. Like, just get the messaging right and repeat it and make it simple and easy, and don't have different areas doing different messaging. That's the thing in Surrey. We've got different districts and boroughs all saying a kind of the same thing, but in a different way, and it's really confusing. So coming together to make that effective.
True.
There's a massive difference between a comms campaign or an awareness campaign and a behaviour change campaign. So if you're looking to change behaviour, there are really proven techniques to do that. And if you just stick a poster out, that's not going to change behaviour. So if you are aiming to change behaviour, try and understand what the techniques that are available that are best suited to you and that you can use.
And Margaret?
I think at the moment, and it sounds a bit cynical, obviously I would say work with existing systems, but I think it's also keep a very close eye on what's coming out of central government and the number of organisations. So my own organisation runs webinars talking about things Chartered Institution does. There's a number of other things that just keep an eye on what's happening, because the rate of pace of change is a weird combination of frustratingly slow and ridiculously quick, depending on whether you're paying attention for that 5-second burst or not.
Thank you, everyone. And it'd be a good time to plug the SEN waste briefings that will be coming out in the next few weeks, covering all stages of the waste hierarchy. And I will be talking to all of our panelists and getting them to feed in some resources and information that haven't been covered in here. So you will get a slice of that. And this recording will also be made available just to the SEN Councillor Network members who weren't able to make it tonight. But thank you so much to our panelists, Truan, Mike, Marissa, and Margaret. And thank you to OPRL for sponsoring this webinar. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.